Forcing a citizen to forfeit one right to exercise another violates fundamental constitutional protections. Introduction. The cornerstone of American constitutional law is the protection of individual rights enshrined in the Bill of Rights and state constitutional provisions. Any statute that compels a citizen to forfeit one right to exercise another, or that conditions the exercise of a right on the acceptance of a government-defined privilege, violates the principles of due process, equal protection, and the foundational concept of unalienable rights. Key legal principles and precedents. Rights are unalienable and cannot be conditioned. The Declaration of Independence declares that individuals are endowed with unalienable rights, which cannot be taken away, conditioned, or bargained by the government. In Marbury v. Madison, 5 U.S. 1 Cranch 137, 1803, Chief Justice Marshall emphasized that a law repugnant to the Constitution is void. Forcing individuals to trade one right for another constitutes an unconstitutional burden on fundamental rights, contrary to this principle. The doctrine of unconstitutional conditions. Under the unconstitutional conditions doctrine, the government may not require a person to forfeit a constitutional right in exchange for a benefit or privilege. In Frost & Frost Trucking Co. v. Railroad Commission, 271 U.S. 583, 1926, the court held that conditioning a public benefit on the surrender of constitutional rights constitutes an impermissible coercion. Example, forcing a citizen to give up their right to privacy, e.g. submitting biometric data, to exercise the right to travel by obtaining a driver's license is an unconstitutional condition. Rights and privileges are distinct. Rights are inherent and protected by the Constitution, while privileges are granted by the government. The government cannot convert rights into privileges and then regulate them under the guise of granting privileges. In Shuttlesworth v. City of Birmingham, 394 U.S. 147, 1969, the Supreme Court affirmed that a right cannot be transformed into a privilege subject to discretionary government control. Ultimatums force coercion, violating voluntariness. Any statute that offers an ultimatum, e.g., giving up the right to a fair trial to plead guilty for a lesser sentence, undermines the voluntariness required for true consent. In Miranda v. Arizona, 384 U.S. 436, 1966, the court emphasized that coercion invalidates choices related to constitutional rights. Specific arguments. Forfeiting one right to exercise. Another hypothetical statutes that demand citizens relinquish their right to free speech, privacy, or property ownership to exercise another right, e.g., obtaining a license or permit to vote, travel, or earn a livelihood, directly infringe on substantive due process under the 5th and 14th Amendments. For example, a state law that requires a citizen to waive their right to sue, protected under the 7th Amendment, as a condition to enter into a government contract, violates the unconstitutional conditions doctrine. Ultimatums that conflate rights with privileges. Conditioning fundamental rights, e.g. the right to travel, on acceptance of regulatory schemes such as driver's licenses, effectively converts those rights into government-controlled privileges. This violates Shapiro v. Thompson, 394 U.S. 6118, 1969, which invalidated residency requirements that infringed on the right to travel. A statute that requires an ultimatum, choosing between the Second Amendment right to bear arms and the First Amendment right to freedom of expression, is inherently invalid as it pits constitutionally protected rights against each other. Violation of state constitutions. Many state constitutions echo or expand upon the Bill of Rights. For instance, state courts have consistently ruled that coercion, duress, or forced forfeiture of rights violates state constitutional guarantees of liberty and equality. Locke v. Davey, 540 U.S. 712, 2004, highlights that even where states have broader constitutional protections, the government may not indirectly coerce citizens to forfeit rights. Practical application. A statute that, for example, requires a person to surrender their right to due process to enjoy freedom of movement, e.g., TSA regulations demanding invasive searches to board a plane, violates the 4th and 5th Amendments. Mandates the forfeiture of property rights, e.g. eminent domain abuses, to obtain a building permit infringes on the 5th Amendment's Takings Clause. Conclusion: the U.S. Constitution and state constitutions provide explicit protections for individual rights that cannot be eroded by statutory schemes. Any law that forces a citizen to forfeit one right to exercise another, or that demands the relinquishment of a right in favor of a government-defined privilege, is void under the principles of constitutional supremacy, the doctrine of unconstitutional conditions, and the fundamental protections of due process and equal protection.